We also left Jerusalem in a calm before the storm last week because the Assyrian threat had been removed. This was taken to be a matter of Yahweh's intervention on behalf of his people. And the consequence of that was a growing belief that Jerusalem would never be taken by the enemy. A belief that tended to be confirmed in the end of the 7th century before the Common Era, when the Assyrian capital Nineveh was actually taken. The result was that a single prophetic book, the work of the prophet Nahum, was brought out simply in order to celebrate Nineveh's demise. But that, of course, did not mean that Jerusalem was inviolate, because the Assyrian Empire was simply replaced by the Babylonian Empire. There were, as we'll see today, many prophets who insisted that although the danger from the east was severe, Jerusalem was going to survive. It did not. In the year 587, there was an invasion by the Babylonian forces. They besieged and took the city of Jerusalem. They systematically dismantled the temple there. And they also reproduced the old Assyrian policy, sending the royal house and the priesthood into exile, this time into Babylonia, and also taking with them the people they considered to be the key commercial and cultural leaders of the city. The purpose of the Babylonian captivity was the same as the purpose of the Assyrian Empire in the case of that northern kingdom, Israel. Now, however, the Babylonian policy was directed towards Judah, Jerusalem in the south instead of Samaria in the north. Any reasonable observer during this period, in the 6th century before the Common Era, would easily have come to the conclusion that just as there had been no trace of Israelite culture left in the north, so now there would be nothing left of the Judahite culture within the south. Two prophets who lived through this entire period, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, are the focus of our discussion today. The first, Jeremiah, persistently insisted that the Babylonians were not only a real threat, but that their threat was going to be accomplished precisely because of the injustice within Jerusalem. From the outset of his work, he portrays his prophecy as not his own. From chapter 1, he says in Yahweh's name, "Before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. Before you came forth out of the womb, I sanctified you, and I ordained you a prophet." And then Jeremiah describes himself as not wishing to accept this commission, and Yahweh coming and touching his lips and saying, "I am putting the words there. You are to represent them." It makes a counterpoint to that commissioning scene of Isaiah that we saw last week within the temple in Jerusalem. Jeremiah needs no temple because, as it turns out, his entire orientation is going to include a serious doubt that the temple is even necessary for the righteousness of God's people. He speaks of himself as pained at his very heart, as unable to hold his peace, as being in the position of hearing the sound of the trumpet of war and having to respond to it, even in advance. He consistently opposes those prophets who insist that God is going to preserve his temple, that there is going to be peace. He specifically, as you see in the handout, cites those who quote what he calls the lying words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. He doesn't want to hear it. He believes the words are offensive. Why? Because the very people saying these things are engaging in theft, in murder, permitting adultery, swearing falsely, he says, burning incense to Baal, walking after other gods who are outside the covenant. From Jeremiah's point of view, there has been a rupture between Yahweh and his people because of their behavior. And that rupture is of such an extent that the Babylonian threat is something which is not conditional any longer. It simply has to come through as a result of this behavior. In taking this position, Jeremiah is seeing the relationship between Israel and God as being more than a matter of their consistent connection. Jeremiah specifically refers to the importance of the covenant, especially in chapter 11. And the way he refers to that covenant is emblematic both of his position and also of the way in which the entire prophetic movement is coming into focus during this period. The word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh saying, "Hear the words of this covenant and speak to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Say to them, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, cursed be the person who does not obey the words of this covenant." And having said that, Jeremiah then, in Yahweh's name, rehearses the whole call out of Egypt, a call that results in there being a direct contractual arrangement, a covenant between Yahweh and Israel. Once broken in Jeremiah's teaching, that covenant can only bring a curse. That is the reason for which Babylonia is going to be triumphant in Jeremiah's point of view. The situation is far more critical than that which had been depicted during the 8th century by Isaiah, where Isaiah is in the position of wishing to call the people of Jerusalem back and offering the prospect of restoration if they listen. From Jeremiah's perspective, it is already too late to act. The covenant has been broken. The consequences of that breach cannot be long delayed. As you might imagine, not everyone in Jerusalem agreed. There were prophets, especially Hananiah, who opposed Jeremiah. And in particular, those who were in charge of the priesthood didn't like being told, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord," represent lying words. And as a result, Pashur, who was one of the governors inside the temple, this is in chapter 20, of Jeremiah, actually has the prophet arrested and put in stocks in order to be publicized as someone who is speaking against the interests of Jerusalem. Here is one of those many cases where it would appear that being a prophet does not give you very high social status. But one of the features of Jeremiah's prophecy that is striking is that even as he is engaged in what is obviously a deeply unpopular message in respect of Jerusalem, he nonetheless does enjoy enough support in order to be able to go on. And in particular, he enjoys the support of a scribal group, the most prominent person in this group, known as Baruch. And so that even when Jeremiah is in a position where he cannot communicate, he is able to send letters. He is able to write books. And therefore, Baruch is able to communicate the message on his behalf. That is the reason for which we have the second example on your sheet under Jeremiah. That is, Jeremiah's advice for when what many people had thought was unthinkable actually happened. They are now sent off to Babylonia. There are naturally people who believe that the interested result of this from someone who was dedicated to the covenant would be to try to overthrow this captivity, to act against the interests of Babylonia. Jeremiah himself was not in Babylonia, not among the exiles. That is something of an irony. Something of an irony because one of those policies that Jeremiah had resisted in response to the Babylonian threat was to form an alliance with Egypt. Jeremiah thought that was an extremely bad idea. And the irony is that after the Babylonians succeeded, he was actually kidnapped by a group and brought to Egypt, of all people. The reason for this is the factions within Jerusalem itself all broke up under the pressure of this Babylonian invasion. There are varying voices insisting that they alone know the way forward. So writing from Egypt, Jeremiah says, surprisingly, to those who are living in captivity, seek the peace of the place where you live. Do not seek to overturn it. Do not try immediately to return, because we have to think in terms of a long period of captivity. Yahweh wants you to plan for 70 years. We have to establish within ourselves the resources that would enable us to survive as the people of Judah during that period of time. So he calls for them to establish their families, to maintain their cultural institutions. And Jeremiah is one of those prophets who joins in the most surprising development during this period of exile. That surprising development is the book that we now call the Bible. Because it was in the exile, during an attempt to maintain the culture of Israel and Judah, that for the first time not only were prophetic books brought together, but they were also reconciled with what had formerly been oral traditions, some partially written, most not, that we now know as the Torah, the Pentateuch. And that is the reason for which you can hear when Jeremiah speaks of the covenant, of the importance of keeping it, of the curses that fall on the person that doesn't keep the covenant, we can hear an echo of the book of Deuteronomy. Because Jeremiah has been reading the book of Deuteronomy. Just as he's been reading Amos when he calls for social justice, and he's been reading Hosea when he characterizes Judah as being without faith, as if an adulterous wife. These are all examples of the way in which Jeremiah represents the prophetic movement crystallizing and also reaching across what we might call party lines to form an alliance with those who had been centrally concerned not with the prophetic movement, but with the Torah that had once governed the temple. Whatever could have brought together priests and prophets? Answer: the destruction of Jerusalem would do it. Because now they come to realize that their survival will be a common survival or no survival whatsoever. And the claim, in fact, of Jeremiah is that in the restored Judah that he speaks of, there's going to be a change in the way that people gain access to the covenant. Instead of its being written in books, it's going to be written in their hearts. That is, they will actually do it. That will be the difference. And when he speaks in chapter 31 of there being a new covenant engraved in the hearts of those who attend to Yahweh, what he doesn't mean is a new covenant in the sense of new content. What he does mean is that the place of this covenant will be inside each Israelite, instead of its being an external authority. Now, I refer to this alliance between those who were guardians of the Torah and the prophetic class as represented by Jeremiah. This is also considerably strengthened when we regard the example of Ezekiel. Ezekiel's opening vision also represents a change in the way in which prophetic commissions are seen. In the case of Jeremiah, we already saw that instead of looking to the moment as Isaiah did when Isaiah was in the temple, Jeremiah sees himself as having been consecrated by God even before his birth. Ezekiel sees the matter in different terms. And the terms of his vision in chapter 1 of his book largely not only show the contrast with Jeremiah, but also predict the way in which Ezekiel's own prophecy would develop. This becomes, of course, the pivotal chapter in the development of all Jewish mysticism, precisely because what Ezekiel is seeing is the chariot throne of God in that first passage. The reason for which it needs to be a chariot as well as a throne is that Ezekiel, unlike Jeremiah, is among the exiles in Babylonia. He describes himself as by the river Kibar. And it is there that he has his vision. And the reason for which that is pivotal is that Ezekiel insists, I didn't need to be in Jerusalem to have this vision. The throne of God need not be understood as existing only over one place on the earth. That had been the former mythology of Jerusalem. Ezekiel directly contradicts that and insists that, in fact, God's throne, the point from which the divine rules everything that is, may be accessed in any place on earth, even in Babylonia. And it's from that place, he says, that he has a vision of what worship in heaven is like. Even if worship on earth has been definitively disrupted because of what the Babylonians have done, nonetheless, worship within the heavens may be known. And then it becomes the purpose of the prophet to explain precisely what that worship is like. Now, in order for Ezekiel to have been brought to this point, he had not only to have been exiled, but also to have developed as a prophet before that time of exile in the year 586. His position in Jerusalem was very much like Jeremiah in being unpopular, in resisting other prophets, but also he is throughout a far more visual prophet. And this, of course, comports with his opening vision. It is a vision, not an audition. He's not called, he sees. So also, when he was a prophet back in Jerusalem, before he was by the river Kibar, he is presented as being called in chapter 4 to make an audio-visual aid for what he's talking about. And he says, go out and take a brick, and on this brick you feature Jerusalem. And you set it up, and then outside your house you make a siege mound around it, and you bring up a battering ram to show what's going to happen to Jerusalem. Believe it or not, some people were offended by that behavior. And their attitude towards Ezekiel did not improve when he was then told, I'll tell you what you do, go and take a nice, sharp, straight razor and shave your head and your beard. Then you take 1/3 of your hair and you burn it. And you take 1/3 of your hair and you chop it up. You smite it with a knife. And you take the other third of your hair and you throw it up into the wind. You think they'll get the message then? What happened was they sent him into prison. And then Ezekiel took the prison experience and began to metabolize that as being a matter of his prophecy. In other words, it is not only that he is by the river Kibar when he has this experience of God's throne, he has actually predicted this move and given the reasons for it. So that when he speaks of that vision, it has already been corroborated by the other more terrible visions that he had while he was still in Jerusalem. In this regard, we can contrast the whole moment of prophecy as understood by Ezekiel as compared to Jeremiah. It's one of the reasons for which having written evidence is so valuable to us. For Jeremiah, he sees and he replicates what he sees. Whether what he sees is the destruction of Jerusalem or the throne vision that he has by the river Kibar. In the case of Jeremiah, prophecy is much more an inner movement, a compulsion to speak. And at times we also see in Jeremiah the way in which he had to search within his own experience in order to find the appropriate words. One example of this in chapter 1 of Jeremiah actually comes down to an excruciating pun. Jeremiah hears a voice that says to him, Jeremiah, what do you see? And he says, oh, I see a shakad. I see an almond tree. And the voice says to Jeremiah, that's because shoked, that is because I am investigating the people of Judah. It's a visual pun. You see one thing, you know the word, it shifts into another. It would be somewhat as if I were to say, prophet, what do you see? And I say, I see a pear tree. That's because I'm sending you 2 presidential candidates, one more narcissistic than the other. I'm not saying which is which. That is, the words and the visions become mutually interpretative in the case of Jeremiah. In the case of Ezekiel, vision proper is becoming the medium of prophecy. And that is occurring during particular and stressful social conditions. Jerusalem and the temple have been lost on the ground. The issue of how to survive has become excruciating. And Ezekiel is insisting, I can see in heaven what is, I can see in heaven what therefore must be on the earth. And that's the reason for that second excerpt that you have on your sheets from Ezekiel. It is from a section that actually begins in chapter 40 and provides a detailed account of a temple that does not actually exist. It tells you who the personnel are who are involved in its worship. It tells you, as you can see, where the prince is to sit, where the monarch of Israel is to be accommodated inside the temple. And you'll see that his job is simply to sit in a vestibule. He is no longer a king who is to direct worship. He is now a prince who is to abide by the visionary authority of this temple. Much of what is said during this section of the book of Ezekiel corresponds to materials that we have in Torah, especially in Leviticus and Exodus, that speak of how the temple in Jerusalem is to be constructed. That is, just as Jeremiah can be seen to align with the book of Deuteronomy in the insistence on the importance of the covenant, so Ezekiel lines up with materials within the Torah known as the Holiness Code, for obvious reasons. That is, it's a code that deals with how the sacred is to be managed in Jerusalem. Now, why has this become the case? Why is it that the movement of written prophecy that we saw back in the 8th century had stressed the importance of social justice, that now, during the period of the exile, the question of ritual should be coming back again? The answer to that question is, to some extent, a matter of circumstances. That is, precisely because the temple now has been lost, prophecy attempts to compensate, to find that location in heaven where the truth of worship nonetheless exists. But the other reason for it is that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, although their emphases are different, agree on a central contention during this period of exile. Namely that social justice can't be called for unless righteousness in worship is also insisted upon. That is, we do not know how it is that we can be just with one another unless we have a correct understanding of the God that we're serving. At the end of the day, their conviction is that worship and justice go together, that they can't be separated from one another. That the attempt to separate them was simply part of the disaster that has led us to where we are at the moment. Now, in that assertion, prophets such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel contributed to the emergence of the Bible pretty much as we would know it. That is, as consisting of the Torah, the revelation to Moses, and the major prophetic works. Obviously, not those prophetic works that we haven't done yet, but the prophetic works that existed in their time, as well as writings such as Psalms and Proverbs. Israel had been lost on the ground, and yet there was a book that told you how to restore this Israel if you ever were in a position to return. Then something astounding concerned. Something occurred that, in fact, Jeremiah had not predicted. Fortunately, Jeremiah was wrong. Fortunately, it did not take 70 years. Had it taken 70 years, would there have been any restoration of Israel? Would those in exile, even with their newfound book, have been able to survive? No one knows how many different civilizations in the ancient world simply succumbed to exile under the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Of these civilizations, there is very little remaining. One occasionally will come across an artifact. If you're lucky, you're able to decipher the writing if there is writing. But in many cases, ancient cultures to us are simply names. Names covered over by the dominance of empires like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Had the Israelites to wait for 70 years, would they have been among that innumerable group of civilizations that passed away? Fortunately, we don't have to answer that question because it all happened much quicker. It happened within a generation. Political circumstances shifted again. Babylon unexpectedly went down. A warrior called Cyrus, who came to be known as Cyrus the Great, came into power and decided that he needed to take Babylonia. He needed to get into the city in a way that wasn't dependent on a full-scale siege. And so Cyrus the Persian made a deal with the priests of Marduk in Babylonia. He said, you know, your new king is far too tolerant of religious innovation. If you let me into the city, I'm going to let you bring back the traditional worship of Marduk, and you'll be back in charge. And the priests of Marduk said, thank you very much. Cyrus came in, and he had this unexpected victory over the Babylonians. And in the midst of his victory, Cyrus came up with an extraordinarily new imperial policy. He said, instead of following the trajectory of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, I have an idea. Why don't we have an imperial policy based on tolerance? Why don't we say, if you're a Jew in Babylonia, you can go back, you can build your temple, don't build a city wall. And the same for all the other captive peoples of Babylonia. I'm never going to get them to worship my God. I mean, he figured out the God of the Medes and the Persians was not going to travel. And indeed, he understood that people were not going to speak his language, Median. So he said, speak Aramaic. But in this recognition of your local gods, you are also going to have to recognize my authority, and that's why you're not going to be building city walls. Well, this was a major turnaround. What would the response of Jewish leaders be? Could they put into effect in the program of Ezekiel and Jeremiah? Should they stay in Babylonia? Was the offer of Jerusalem with a temple but without city walls truly acceptable? We'll have to see next week. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, please.
I'm trying to put different things together, so an observation, if you could help clarify it or correct it afterwards. Seems to me when the Hebrews were wandering in the wilderness, instead of having a God that lived on this mountain or in that place, their God was able to travel with them as they were nomads. That seems to be a parallel to me to what you were describing today, which was when, after the temple was destroyed, two things. The new covenant, which was written on their hearts, so again, that could travel with them. It wasn't dependent on someone external, an external authority. And at the same time, the beginning of the writing down of what we came to know the Bible meant that it was less dependent on the vagaries of oral tradition, and again was something that was more lasting. And that was maybe unique, or seems to be unique to the Hebrew people, and may have contributed to their lasting, when other civilizations didn't.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for these observations. The one concerns the issue of mobility. The fact that literally, if we look to the earliest traditions of Israel, Yahweh was mobile. Yahweh was mobile in the Ark of the Covenant until it was captured. And then when the Ark comes to rest in the temple comes to be seen as Yahweh's dwelling. The exile forced Israelite prophecy to answer the question, how do we now understand God to be with us? And Jeremiah is offering a view that says that we ought to be able to look, each of us, introspectively, and to see Yahweh, as it were, burning in our hearts. Ezekiel, in a more visionary tradition, sees the possibility of divine disclosure wherever you may be. But nonetheless, under either construction, divine mobility is being addressed as a question. And then on the side of the importance of writing, indeed we are now seeing during this period a privileging of the written word. The default position of religious traditions is that oral tradition is better than written tradition. Why? Because let's say you're a priest in charge of a temple. You know what you're doing because you were told by your father and his father and his father, and it is, as it were, in our veins. What we have to know, we recite by memory. And we have a sense of that consistent pattern over generations. Writing doesn't seem to occur unless there is some form of crisis within a religious tradition. Within other traditions, writing might occur. For example, for purposes of accounting, to establish royal authority. But within religious traditions, typically it occurs when something happens like a temple is destroyed. Or at an earlier period, as we've seen, when a prophet such as Amos cannot be sure that his prophecy is going to survive in the oral tradition, so he has to resort to scribes. But once the resort to writing has occurred, then that religious tradition has, as it were by accident, created a resource which is capable of seeing its identity through subsequent crises. That appears to have been the case when the Hebrew Bible is concerned. Al?
I understood that Ezekiel was a priest of a priestly class.
Mm-hmm.
So, what's the story?
Yes, that's right. And this is one reason for his particular interest in the temple. It comes with the territory of his identity.
Let me just expand by saying that.
And that in turn is why he's in Babylonia. See, that's why he's among those who have been exiled.
Okay. What I thought, in other words, he was marrying the Torah culture, the Torah tradition, and the prophetic tradition. And now a third, the priestly tradition, or that's part of the Torah tradition?
Yeah, and this is where I think Jeremiah and Ezekiel are both comparable, but also distinctive. Both Jeremiah and Ezekiel are marrying, to use your analogy, I think it's a good one. They're marrying the prophetic tradition with the Torah. However, their interests are with distinctive aspects of the Torah. Jeremiah is more interested in the covenant side, especially as expressed in the book of Deuteronomy. Ezekiel is much more concerned with what's usually known as the holiness code, that is, those materials that have to do with the development of the temple. But the Torah contains both of those. And what I was saying is, that's no accident. That is, the Torah actually represents the prophetic insight that ritual and social justice should not be seen as separable. That's why they're together in the law of Moses, because the prophets had a hand in redacting the law of Moses. If it had been priests alone who had done the Torah for us, it would have been a very different looking piece of work. Likewise, had it only been 8th century prophets, it would have looked different. But because the Torah as we know it emerged during the exile, it has this twin emphasis on justice and correct sacrifice. Yes, please.
Since you spoke about this trend in exile in Babylonia of the mobility of Yahweh, right? And also the prophecies and the Torah were being ripped. Did that mean there were multiple copies of this? Or did the Jews in exile in Babylonia have to go to one place again like they would have had to go in Jerusalem to hear the word of God and to read it?
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent question about how it is that this written Bible emerges. Is there one copy, several copies? Who exactly gets the job of the editorial work? In some cases, it appears to be the case, and a premier example of this as it happens is the book of Jeremiah. In some cases, it appears to be the case that we need to face the probability of there being more than one very early written copy. Why? Because Jeremiah, as I mentioned, was stuck in Egypt. This editorial work primarily went on in Babylonia. In this regard, the Babylonian exile was also a tremendous help for the emergence of the Bible, because it put together all of those who were responsible for the tradition that became biblical in one place. And therefore, they could see to the production of a text. But what happens when you have someone's text, like Jeremiah, who's still alive, and who's not in Babylonia? There's another tradition of the book of Jeremiah, represented not in Hebrew, but in the Greek Bible, the Septuagint. It's shorter. Its order is different. And where there are differences, it appears to be the case, strangely enough, that the Greek version of Jeremiah seems nearer the original than the Hebrew version. In other words, the Greek is translating an earlier Hebrew original than what made it to Babylonia. So there is an indication that we are indeed probably dealing with multiple copies of works, but whatever had reached Babylonia was edited there by what I would call a consortium of the prophetic and the priestly groups who are held together in this scribal enterprise and who, as a result, managed to produce a work that represents a balance of ritual and ethical concerns. Yes, please, Bob. You sang so well, I have to.
I was going to sing one more thing. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept, for these are young. One of the songs, English number, was obviously written at that time.
Exactly.
Beautifully, actually, down in the islands here, one of the Rastafarians took up that by the rivers of Babylon. So, but what I'm getting shook by is I'm reading a lot into the beginning of socialism, communism, Jewish support for this, and what you're saying about the joining of social justice with ritual, where the communist Jews, I'll always speak of those, which are parents of any political party, went the other direction, just social action with no rituals. And what did that mean? It meant they thought they could do it, only human beings could do it, without a recognition of God and God's covenant, God's power, which in some ways, in a positive way, makes us more humble and less ready to take over the world. So if we've only had Jeremiah here in the 20th century, it would have been so hard.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful comment. I'll just repeat part of what you said for the sake of the Cardinal of Red Hook's tape, pointing out the support during the development of socialism and communism of many Jewish groups who appeared to see social justice as something that stood on its own, quite apart from the issue of worship. I agree with you, but I would also say that this was actually representing a typically Western theme during the 19th and the 20th centuries. When I was in seminary, and many of us were in seminary, we were exposed to the view that said that the prophets were a social justice movement that opposed the priests. Well, that's partially true. I mean, I gave the example today of Pashur putting Jeremiah in stocks. Sure enough, you don't do that to a friend. This doesn't count as friendly disputation, even in academic circles. But having said that, at the end of the day, because the prophets are looking to restoration, they see the importance of the temple, and they also are convinced that Israel's apostasy was not only a matter of doing individual things wrong. It was because of a rejection of Yahweh overall. They come to believe that even though they have to oppose certain elements of the cult and sometimes oppose an entire system of worship, like Amos at Bethel, that nonetheless, unless you combine ethics and worship, neither of them is going to be properly oriented. Yes, please.
This may be a stretch, but in current Israel, one can think of the prophets as for example, the writers Amos Oz or David Grossman preaching the importance of social justice. And the priestly class, perhaps the secular one, are people like Benjamin Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister, and they are equally at odds.
There's an observation aligning writers such as Amos Oz with the prophetic and Benjamin Netanyahu with the priestly side of the argument. I just think I'll say, that's an interesting analogy. Betsy?
Well, so that's been continued in Christianity with faith and works, and that whole thing has been going on.
Yeah, without any question, Christianity then has been influenced not only by the prophets, but also by its own conception of the prophets. For another project, I've just been reading recently about the development of what was called the social gospel movement. And although Bob was talking about the tendency of some Jewish opinion to see prophecy in only a partial way, only on the social justice side, clearly within Christianity the same thing was going on during the 19th and the 20th centuries. In other words, if one perceives the prophets as being concerned with justice to the exclusion of other matters, that will tend to influence the way you yourself behave. And that's one reason for which I think that if one looks at the development of the prophetic movement overall, it's a useful corrective for us in understanding how it is that it's possible for us to find our orientation as human beings. You refer to the issue of faith and works. Without question, Martin Luther pointed to the prophet Habakkuk, who we'll come to, in insisting that the just man shall live by his faith. And Martin Luther was operating within the assumption of St. Paul that this focus on faith was to be understood as apart from the whole question of works. I would say that if you look at the prophetic tradition as a whole, that's a questionable assumption. Apologies in that regard to Martin Luther, but I think if one looks more carefully, one sees the relationship between faith and works is rather more complex than that. Yes, please.
On a different topic, I'm interested in Cyrus the Great, and I'm interested that he was currently used diplomacy and currently used tolerance. And I'm wondering whether the seeds of his faith had any parallel at all to the seeds that are going on with his other faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very interesting. Cyrus the Persian and his policy is represented in an object that you can still see in London at the British Museum, in an artifact known as the Cyrus cylinder. It's not big, it's just this big, it's cylindrical, and he wrote on it what his decree was, saying, the Jews can go back, the Lydians can go back, the Egyptians can go back, worship their gods. I am able to do this because of my God, the great king. And by the way, I'm the great king too. That is, he saw himself from a position of supreme assurance because ultimately he believed that he could have control over all of these cultures by means of the policy of toleration. It was a radical change from what had gone on before. It appears to have been more practical than anything else, much as his linguistic policy was a tremendous success, but it involved him in having to give ground, apparently, at the beginning. He was saying, I am not imposing my local language on my empire, but I am requiring that their language, which is already the most common, Aramaic, should be the official language. Everyone is going to speak this. And he insisted upon that policy, of course, long before Alexander the Great. Cyrus the Persian is really giving the possibility of empire to global culture by the policy of toleration and linguistic transparency that the Greeks would inherit at a later stage, and the English after that. Yes, please.
The Egyptians, or the group that emigrated to Egypt, culturally disappeared. The group that the Babylonian flourished and developed a lot of, made a tremendous Jewish influence, or survival, even if you want to call it, of Judaism.
Yeah.
Why is that difference?
This is a wonderful contrast, the contrast between the exile in Egypt at the time of Moses and the exile in Babylonia. In the case of the exile in Egypt, you have basically a very loose clan structure centered around Abraham, whose tradition is entirely oral. And therefore, insofar as you remember where you came from, this is as a result of a recitation over time. It appears to be the case that the actual customs of what would be called Israel are not entirely fixed at the time that they go out into Egypt, much less when they emerge from Egypt. For example, how important is the fact that circumcision was practiced in Egypt? Was this an acquired tradition? Or did the clan of Abraham go down there with that tradition? Or another example, it was during the period of the exile in Egypt that an Egyptian pharaoh got the wild idea in his head that there was only one God. Did this have an influence on the early Israelites? Those are imponderable questions, precisely because we do not have what we do have for the Babylonian exile, namely a written statement from the people who were exiled as to who they believed they thought they were at the time. So my response to the question is to say that the principal difference between those two exiles is that in the first, the only thing that was a standard of identity was oral tradition, and in the case of the Babylonian exile, there was a written tradition, namely the Bible itself. Nice question. Oh, the Cardinal of Rendhoek is giving me that sign, so I think we should wind up, and thank you for coming.